Have you ever met someone who suffers from a mental illness? If so, then were you curious as to how they developed the illness or if they were born with it? Well, I have, and I never actually thought much about it until I read an article on how mental illness can affect people into their adulthood. Then, after I read the article, I decided I wanted to look more into the issue to decide for myself if I believe incidents from people's childhood can actually affect them into adulthood. I came to the conclusion that I agree with the article, and I now know that people can suffer from mental illness due to past experiences. Now that I've educated myself on the topic, I would like to talk to you about some of the reasons as to why people can suffer long-term effects such as mental illness due to childhood neglect or abuse. To begin, I want to start with what mental illness is. According to dictionary.com, the definition for mental illness is any various disorders in which a person's thoughts, emotions, or behavior is so abnormal as to causing suffering to himself, herself, or other people. These disorders can be conditions such as anxiety, depression, inability to manage anger, sleeping problems, and many more things of the sort. The stress the brain is put under so early on in one's life can change its functions permanently. Now that we know what mental illness is, let's cover some of the traumas a child can experience that can potentially cause these disorders. According to the ebook, How Childhood Trauma Can Physically Damage the Developing Brain and How These Effects Can Be Reversed by David Hoser, 2019, lack of emotional security, poverty, constant humiliation, domestic violence, anger, emotional neglect, guilt, and lack of love. Those are all reasons that can cause children trauma. Children can find these incidents to be traumatic in some cases, and they can cause a lasting impact on their lives. Prevent Child Abuse America's newsletter from 2020 states, the impact of neglect can be very serious in both short and long term, and sometimes lifelong. The CDC has numbers and statistics that states that at least 50% of children will experience some form of neglect within their childhood. Out of that 50% of children, the most common type of abuse children suffer from is neglect from a caretaker. The second most common form of abuse children suffer from is physical abuse causing harm to the child. They are physically harming the child. Emotional abuse is the third most common form of abuse children can experience, and caretakers are the cause for this being the third most common type. These three things can potentially be prevented with the proper screening of caretakers before being hired into facilities or into people's homes. With actions such as the correct screening of caretakers and wellness checks for people who have been suspected of child abuse, it could potentially spare a life living with mental illness due to trauma. There is no worldwide solution to the issue of trauma and neglect for all children suffering from it, but there are actions that people who know it's happening can take. With things such as one small step, things can be changed for the better. The important thing that someone who knows of an abusive home can do is report the abuse. It can be reported by calling 911 or Child Protective Services. Only call 911 if you believe that the child is in immediate danger. When filing a report with CPS, it can be done anonymously. This action could possibly save the child's life if taken soon enough. If the action of reporting the abuse and neglect was done as often as it should be, then children would not have to suffer the effects of abuse they didn't ask for. There are multiple ways to identify signs of neglect and abuse, and everyone needs to know these. According to the article Child Abuse and Neglect, written by Healthwise Incorporated, 1995 to 2020, a child may not grow as expected, may be dirty or unhealthy, may seem fearful, anxious, or depressed. These illnesses can begin early on when the abuse is happening, or they can develop later in life when the person is an adult. A study of brain scans of a person who had a normal childhood were compared to someone who suffered from neglect, and parts of the neglected person's brains were permanently affected. The part of the brain being affected makes the abused person more susceptible to having a mental illness. According to the article, Our Childhood Trauma and Chronic Illness Connected, for children, the stress of experiencing trauma can cause very similar changes to those seen in PTSD. Trauma can cause the body's stress response system into high gear for the rest of the child's life. And with that statement, my point has been validated and backed by plenty of evidence. I believe that childhood neglect can be caused and it can follow people into adulthood and forever change one's life. If you still aren't a believer that mental illness can be caused by childhood neglect, then I strongly suggest that you do more research for yourself. There's a large amount of research that can be backed by this statement. In closing, I would like for you to think about everything you've heard in this speech today. Think about the difference you can make if you know that someone is being abused and you take action. Think about how you can comfort someone who has a mental illness due to childhood trauma. We should always try and make an impact on our world, especially when it comes to helping others. Always remember that you can make a change, and you should always think of other situations before deciding what you think of someone, because sometimes it's not always just something she did to herself. Maybe it's something she couldn't help. I hope I was able to maybe change someone's way of thinking today, and maybe let someone see things in a different perspective. Thank you.